quilty friends, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today I'm going to show you all about how to bind a zigzag edge because it has this little inset corner, which can be a bit of a bugger if you don't know how to do it, but once you know the secret, y'all, you are going to be a quilting binding machine for all these zigzag edges. You ready? Let's get started. So hopefully you've seen the launch of the diamond strip ruler, which is how this quilt was made. This is the diamond 9-patch quilt, and the pattern is available for this quilt. I love this quilt so much. It's made with scraps and a background fabric, and that's it. So it comes together so easy. I loved making this quilt. It was so much fun. And now it's time to bind it. Now I could have trimmed off this edge straight and just done it to bind a regular rectangle, which you totally can do if you make this quilt. It's your quilt, you can make it however you want. But if you wanted to do a zigzag edge on your quilt, which is a little fun, I'm going to show you how easy it is to do that because it's so much easier than you think. I'm going to start with this binding that we made a couple weeks ago. You might remember the video. I'll link this at the end as well as down in the description if you need the video on how to make bias binding. Now we do need bias binding for this quilt. You can't use straight cut binding. So this is bias binding, and what that means is that it's been cut on the bias. So you'll see it has a point, which is part of it being on the bias. It was cut at a 45-degree angle, and it looks like a regular strip because all of the strips were cut at 45 degrees. But it means that this edge right here, the weave of the fabric is going this way and this way, so you're catching all of the ends of all of the threads, and that allows it to have this like give and stretch. Let's bring this a little closer and you can see it has this give and stretch, which is exactly what you need when you're putting a binding on anything that's unusually shaped. So an inset corner like this, if you have a quilt that has scallops and you want to do the binding around the curves of the scallops, or if you're doing curved corners on your quilt and you want to quilt around the curved corners, any of those you want to have bias binding. Okay, so we have our bias binding. It's all set to go. I have this little doohickey that I sometimes use to put my phone in when I'm doing video for my phone, so I can put the binding kind of around there and it can more easily go around there. Someone who has, on my other sewing machine, I have a lamp that goes across the top so I can do it over the lamp. If you have some way to kind of have this up and out of the way, that is handy when putting on any binding, but it's not required. And then we're going to start by attaching the binding on a straight edge. So this quilt has 2 straight sides, and then the top and bottom are the zigzag. So I'm going to pick one of the straight sides. There we go. And I'm going to start on one of the straight sides. And we're going to take this binding, and I'm going to give myself at least 10 inches, probably more, of tail before attaching the binding. Now this quilt has been trimmed up. I actually had my long armor trim it up for me, which is a super awesome tip. If you are having your quilt long armed by a professional long armor, you can ask them, hey, how much would it be for you to square up my quilt for me? Because a lot of them will offer that as an additional service, and they'll square it up for you, and that's one less step that you need to do before putting on the binding. And especially if you live or work in a space where you don't have a big area to be able to square up your quilt, getting it back fully squared up, it's not expensive, and it's really worth it to me. So I usually ask my long armor if she'll just square up the quilts for me. Okay, so we have our quilt. We're going to lay it kind of flat out on the table, and we are going to attach this binding. Now, attaching it across the straight edge, and again I have that like nice long tail for when I get it all the way around. Attaching it along the straight edge is pretty simple. I use a 2-inch binding. Some people like 2.5 inch binding, some people like 2.25 inch binding. The binding that is wrong is the binding that doesn't work for you. The binding that is right is the binding that works for you. So pick the binding size that works for you and do that. All right. And because I use 2-inch binding, I just attach it with a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, this is bias binding. So I'm sewing along this long straight side until I get to this corner, and this would traditionally be like my squared off corner end, but instead it's at this big wide angle, and that's actually a super easy angle to do. So we're going to just sew all the way off the end, and on the other opposite corner of the quilt you will have one that is the sharp angle to this wide angle, and you'll do the same thing. You just stitch off the end of the quilt. That's honestly the easiest way to do these angles, and you can honestly do this with your right angled quilts as well if you find corners difficult. And then you flip up just like you would with a regular, and then flip back down, and then make sure that the corner fabric is out of the way. And this is a little tight here on the corner, so I'm just going to pick out a stitch or two. That'll make that a little easier. There we go. So I can flip up and then flip back down, and make sure that none of the excess is in the way. And now when I start stitching, I'm going to start stitching, and I'm going to go back and forth because I've got a raw end of thread here, so I want to make sure that I've anchored that with that back and forth. So now it's just a straight edge, just like normal, until we get to another big angle. Big angle is going to be done the same way. Go off the edge or up to the edge. I'm going to turn everything so it fits right back onto the sewing machine again. Flip that up. And then anchor my stitches to start. And go along the straight edge. So really it's not different than your traditional 90-degree corners when you have those big wide angles. But it's when you get to what we're about to get to right here, which is that inset angle, that things get tricky. So I'm coming up to this inset angle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut just shy of a 1/4 inch, and I'm actually cutting into the quilt. Yes, I am. Just shy of a 1/4 inch, because I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach my binding. And I don't want a hole in my quilt, so I don't want to go over a 1/4 inch. And if you need to mark it, go ahead. And now I'm going to sew all the way up to that point. Then I'm going to pivot the quilt, not the binding, just the quilt. My needle is down, which is holding everything in place. And then I've just pulled the quilt as if there was no angle there at all. I'm going to keep going straight. If you didn't catch that, that's okay. We're going to do it again. We have a big wide angle here. Let's do our quick wide angle. And the more of these you do, the faster you'll get at it. There we go. Anchor that in place. We're going to come up to another inset corner and bring it up a little further. We're going to clip this just shy of a 1/4 inch. We're going to sew all the way up to that corner as if we're just sewing a straight seam, because we are. And where we want to sew to is, see where this seam line is right here? We want to sew to right there, right where that seam line is. And I have a guard on this foot, so it's actually pressing that out already, which is great. Then I'm just going to pull the quilt straight, and that little clip that we did is what allows that to pull straight like that. And then you just keep on sewing. I'll do this one more time. I'll zoom out so that you can see one more time doing the corners from a little bit of a further away angle. Going to go up to or just off the edge on our big wide angle. Flip this up. Anchor our stitches to start. I'm coming up to my inset angle. I actually got a little close to it. I want to clip just shy of a 1/4 inch. Going to sew straight. And you can lift up if that guard is in the way. Right up to the seam line. Lift up the presser foot, which allows you to move the fabric underneath. Straighten it out again. And then just sew. Alright, I've got a couple more of these to do. And then I've got my straight edges. I have these zigzags on both sides. Actually, for this one, I'm going to, rather than cut my thread, I'm going to do basically what we do on a traditional corner, a little flip method. So there's another way that you can do a corner. You can flip it ahead of time, which is what I do on my 90-degree angles. I just think that's easier. And my whole quilt is getting off my table. When your quilt starts pulling off your table, then the weight of your quilt with gravity just pulls the whole thing and you have less control. So it's okay to have a giant wadded ball of quilt next to you, because that giant wadded ball of quilt is all on the table, so it's not pulling off the table, and that's what you don't want. You don't want it pulling off the table. So I'm going to do my little 1/4 inch clip, or we'll just shy of 1/4 inch clip. So right up, lift that presser foot, pull everything straight, presser foot down because your machine will not sew with the presser foot up, and then just keep going. Okay, so I have the other sides of this quilt to do, the other straight edge, the other zigzag edge, and then bring the binding all the way back around to the beginning again. And then once I've done that, we are going to join our two binding ends, and then we'll talk about bringing the binding to the back, because at this point we've just sewn it onto the front and we need to bring it to the back. So once I get to having this binding machined on all the way around, I'll get right back with you. Okay, so I have the binding on all the way around from the front side, and we'll be bringing it to the back shortly, except I need to join my ends. And I've shown this in other videos, but I don't want to send you to another video to get this tip. So we're just going to talk about here how to join the ends. So I'm bringing as much of the quilt up on my table as I can, just so that gravity isn't, again, pulling it down. And we're going to look at these two ends. I made sure that I have, oh gosh, that's probably about 20 inches of unsewn quilt. And then I have one side, and I'm going to, about in the middle of that 20 inches or so, cut. It doesn't have to be perfect. What we want is for these two sides to meet up. And the question is how to cut these. Now the easiest way, and this way has gone very viral on how to know how big to cut it, is that you take that little piece of binding that I cut off, and I'm going to line it up with the edge that I just cut. And now this piece right here I'm going to lay over, and everything needs to be smooth and flat. And I will cut just this top piece right here. Don't cut through all the layers. We're just cutting this top. So now the overlap on this top and bottom piece are the width of the binding, which in this case is 2 inches because I did 2-inch binding. And now all we need to do is take these two pieces and put them together. So we put them together, and just like when we sew our binding pieces, we're going to sew on the diagonal so that the diagonal goes between the two sides we're going to keep and the two sides we're not. So make sure that there's no twists in here. And then to bring this over to the machine, I find that it helps to put a pin or two, and I'm going to be careful here because I'm not going to pin the quilt, I'm just pinning my binding. And 2 pins is generally better here because 1, it's so easy for it to twist around, but 2 will give it a little more stability. And then pulling this quilt up onto the table, I can bring this little binding corner over to the sewing machine. Grab those 2 pins, and I'm going to eyeball this binding because that's what I usually do, because I'm a binding eyeballer. But you can absolutely draw a diagonal line if that makes you more comfortable when sewing this. We're just going to sew diagonally. And now we're not going to cut this off yet, because if we made a mistake, and there's always that chance, there we go. And I think I just won that bobbin chicken. I totally did. I just won a bobbin chicken. I'm going to have to swap out that bobbin in a second. But let's just double check this binding. I'm going to bring it over to our flat table here. And that should lay nice and smooth. That looks pretty good to me. So now and only now will I trim away this down to 1/4 inch and finger press. You can bring this to an iron if that makes you happy to iron it. I'm not generally happy to iron things. I'm happy to just finger press. So I'm going to swap out my bobbin, and then I'm going to sew this down, and then I'll have my binding all the way around all the sides, and we'll talk about attaching it to the back. Okay, I have the binding all the way around the quilt, and I know it looks different now because this is the back of the quilt. I have this is the front, and then this is the backing. I chose a really different backing on this. It almost makes it like a double-sided quilt with like this really fun print, but because it was all scraps, I thought like a fun kind of scrappy looking back would be fun for this one. So I have it all the binding on along the front, and now we need to bring it to the back. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. I have a whole video on attaching binding completely with a sewing machine, which you can watch, and I'll make sure to link that at the end and down in the description. And then I like to glue baste my binding to the back because that keeps me from having to use any clips or pins. And whether you hand attach it after you glue baste to the back or whether you machine attach it after you glue baste to the back is up to you. This one I am going to do by hand because of those insets. I want to be really gentle with the way that I do those, so I'm going to do it by hand. But we're going to do a lot of the basting by glue just to make it go a little faster. So I have my iron over here. She's all heated up. So I have a nice hot iron. And I have my quilt And then I have my glue, and I just use Elmer's school glue. This says it's a stronger formula. Maybe I grabbed a different one, but we're going to use this one today. It'll be fine. Probably. I'm sure it will be. Okay, now the questions that I get when I talk about glue basting is it going to ruin the machine? And what people are thinking of when we talk about is it going to ruin the machine is we're thinking about those big giant clumps of glue on kindergarten projects. Like kindergartners put glue and then they put glitter or cotton balls, and then those big like rocks of dried up Elmer's glue on there that if your needle tried to go through that, it would probably be really bad. That's not what we're doing here. We're going to do a very, very, very thin, fine line of glue, and then we're going to press it with the iron, which is going to, the weight of the iron is going to smush it so it's super, super thin, and then the heat of the iron is going to set that glue so that it dries. So there's no sticky part of the glue because it's dry, and there's no big lump because it's going to get pushed really flat. So even if your needle were to go through the spot where the glue was, it'll be fine. I've done this on so many quilts with no problems, and I've never had someone come back to me and said that they had a problem either. And there's lots of quilters. I didn't come up with this method, so there's lots of quilters who use this. It's not just me. All right, so let's go ahead and do some glue. So you can, and it's not a terrible idea, and usually I do, but I didn't this time, go on the front of your quilt and press that binding along that front edge, and that'll give you a nice clean front edge of your quilt. And then we're going to take our glue and there are specialty glue tips that you can get if you like this method a lot to do really fine lines of glue. I just squeeze lightly. There we go. You can barely see it, but I can see it. And then you want to pull your binding so that it is past this straight line of stitches, because that straight line of stitches is the line of stitches on the front that's holding the binding to the front. So you want to, basically we're just hiding that straight line of stitches. We're just going just past that. And this is why I love 2-inch binding, because 2-inch binding I can put on with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then it wraps basically perfectly right around the edge. So there we go. I have a whole foot of binding done on this quilt, which is, let's face it, not a lot. Okay. So I'm going to, let's bring this to the other side. I've got a lot of gravity going on with this quilt. I'm trying to pull it off the end of the table. So now that's doing the straight edge. The straight edge is pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. Now I want to do this zigzag edge, because the zigzag edge is the part that seems like it should be hard, right? All right, let's find out. All right, so I could go all the way down this edge and flip this over, but I've already checked this. And if I flip this over this way and this over this way, what I'm going to end with on this side is, this side was also flipped this way and this side's flipped this way. And that gives you, let's see if you can see it if I go up close. That gives you what they call a binding nose, where both of them kind of see two nostrils, right? And apparently that's not what we want. So I've recently learned about binding noses. They sound like something we don't want to do. So I'm going to start halfway on this side, because I don't know yet which way will give me a binding nose on that side. So we want them to go opposite directions, which means I want to do this side first and then finish up my long side. So same thing as before. Flip this over. Let me not melt a hole in the bottom of my glue bottle. That would be bad. Perfect. And now let's do this long side. And it can help to have like a cup or dish to hold your glue in so that it stays glued down. And that way you don't have to wait for the glue to come into the tip every time. Right now I'm putting it on its side, so the glue, I have to get it back into the tip. And then I'm going to add just a little dab of glue right here where the two binding corners meet. Give that a good press, which makes it nice and flat. Look at that. That, I mean, I need to cut a thread there, but other than cutting that thread, that is a pretty perfect corner. All right, we have another corner like that right here. Let's see which way is my nose. So same way, I need to come from this side. So let's come from this side. Do this side first. Now, if you have noses on the corners of your bindings, does that mean that you fail as a quilter? No. No, it's just a preference if you want to pay attention to it. And if you don't, that's okay. A bound quilt is still a finished quilt. Now we're to our inset corner, and on the front, let's make this flat. We'll end up with a little pleat. I'm going to go ahead and press that. There we go. And we'll bring this to the back. Look at that. That's pretty darn perfect. All right, I'm gonna add my glue. I want to keep there. I wanted to keep that pleat consistent, like in the same spot, so I don't end up with a ruffled pleat. That sounds weird. And still make sure that my binding was going up above that stitch line. But there we go. That is the inset corner. Let's go ahead and do another set. So I'm going to, now this one's a little trickier because if you see, I have my binding was meeting up with itself right there. So I have a binding seam right here. And the reason I say that that's trickier is because you've got extra bulk going on when you've got a seam. When I did my video on making bias binding, I talked about how pressing open reduces the bulk, but there still is more bulk. Reducing the bulk doesn't give you no bulk, it just gives you less bulk. So let me get my pleat up here. So there is still extra bulk, so we just want to treat that a little more carefully. And then with my noses, I want to do this side first again. So I'm going to do this one more inset corner so you can see how we tack those down on the back. And the reason it's going so easily is because we did our bias binding. If you were to do a straight cut binding, it would not go as easily because you wouldn't be able to get that stretch that you need from the binding. You could try it, you will be frustrated. It is very frustrating to try to get straight cut binding to behave the way you would expect a bias binding to, because it won't. You'll get puckers and pleats and yeah. Basically bias binding is a lot more forgiving. Let's do this last one. I'm just going to bring it up. And because of that seam right in there, it's going to be a little more curved. We're not going to get that point like we did on the last one, and I'm going to be okay with that because there's a seam there. So I'll just be a little more understanding with myself that that's not going to be as sharp. There we go though. Still pretty good. Okay, so you can choose to glue baste all the way around like I have here. You can glue baste everything down so that you don't have to clip it or pin it. Or if you prefer, you can use clips or pins. I just find that this is like having a third hand. The glue holds everything in. And now we can hand tack down the binding. You can also do this by machine. Since it has been glue basted, this would be easy enough to do by machine. But this one, I really like this one, and I want to give it that extra care of giving it a hand binding. I don't think that there's anything wrong with a machine binding. Definitely if you're entering something in a show, you would want to do a hand binding if you're trying to get some kind of award, because generally speaking, judges look kinder on a hand binding versus a machine binding. It just looks, I guess, more traditionally finished, and quilting is a traditional hobby. But I do not think we should like look down on machine bound quilts. All right, so let's, I'll show you how you do your hand binding. All right, so we're all zoomed in, and I have my thread. Now I'm going to, and I need to put my little readers on here. Here inside the binding. So inside that seam allowance. Some people do a knot. I've spent far too much time getting knots out of my thread that I don't put knots in my thread. I do 3 stitches in place. So there's 1, there's 2, and if you don't like the idea of not having a knot, then on 1 or all 3 of these, just put the needle through the loop, and ta-da, you've done a knot. All right, so that's secured the end of my thread. I'm just using a single strand of thread, and I bring it up now outside of that stitching line. So I brought it up out the thread on the other side of the stitching line. I'm just going to grab the edge of the binding, and I'm going to tack it down straight and move the needle over about 1/8 of an inch. Same thing. I'm going to grab just the very edge of the binding and go and move forward about 1/8 of an inch. And I'm just grabbing that very edge, and I picked a thread that should disguise itself pretty well with this binding. And moving forward about 1/8 of an inch. And then I will take this in front of the TV, and this will be a TV project while I'm watching a movie or a show with my family. And over the course of a couple evenings, I will get this quilt fully hand bound, and then this will be a hand bound quilt. This is also why not every quilt that I do is a hand bound quilt, because it takes a lot of time to hand bind a quilt, and I often want to get on to my next project. So you can't spend the time to hand bind and be working on a next project because there's just one of me. I can't do both. So I tend to machine bind a lot of my quilts, but this one I'm going to hand bind. So there we go. I'm putting the binding on this zigzag edge of this quilt, which is going to look so cute when it's done. I like that I picked a little bit of a darker binding color on this, so it's really going to stand out. I love how this looks. Friends, if this video was helpful, make sure that you've given it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. Really, hit that subscribe button. It helps me out here on YouTube. It lets other people know that it's a good channel. So hit that subscribe button, and it lets you know when I have new videos up that you want to come watch. So hit the subscribe button, and if you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. I've tried to anticipate a lot of your questions. Let me know if I answered your question before you were even able to ask it. But if I didn't, go ahead and ask your question, and I will try to get you an answer as well. Friends, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you right here real soon. Bye for now.